Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and welcome to a new series on the channel. We're going to be taking a retrospective look at the various jobs in Final Fantasy XIV. I just released my Melee versus for Endwalker, which you should definitely go check out as well. But that wasn't the only thing on my mind. You see, I had a weekly Q&A question where someone asked if there was a way to view the changes for the various jobs throughout the years, maybe looking back to stuff from A Realm Reborn and seeing how it is today comparatively. I couldn't think of anything off the top of my head, so I figured, why don't I just do it? And I think I have the perfect way to do it. So we're going to be exploring some of the old versions of the jobs and look at how they were updated throughout each expansion. The series really only works for the really old jobs, maybe as far back as Stormblood, but really the A Realm Reborn and Heavensward era, which had a completely different design philosophy. But today, we're going to be taking a look at the first job that I rated on in this game, and that is Bard. So in order to do this, we're going to need accurate information about the skills from way back when. While there are plenty of ways to obtain this information, I decided to use a handy internet tool named the Wayback Machine. It allows you to pull archived versions of old websites to look at what the contents once were at any given date. It's usually used to combat misinformation, and they are actually raising money to try to make sure that the site can continue to function, similar to what you may see when you visit the wiki page at certain points of the year. But we're going to be using that to visit old versions of wiki sites in order to see what the skills were like and get an accurate representation of those jobs in those various expansions. We're going to be using Gamer Escape for A Realm Reborn and Heavensward, and then the job guide on the official Final Fantasy XIV site for 4.0, 5.0, and well, current, which we really don't need to go over. So with that, let's get started. And here we are for our starting point, Bard. Oh, the really old Gamer Escape format for the way the jobs were. And right away we have our very first thing that we need to note. Back in those days, as you can see when we look on the right, we have equipable actions, Archer, Pugilist, and Lancer, and the requirement of 30 Archer and 15 Pugilist in order to unlock Bard. Yeah, way back when you had to level 2 different classes to unlock a job, and we had cross-class actions back then, where you could actively pull skills from specific classes once you advanced to a job. That was really the only advantage of classes themselves, is they could pull from more equipable actions, but the jobs being as focused as they were meant they were better in most things, but not all of them. Alright, first it has the job actions listed for Bard, and all of these are a time-traveling trip. Back in A Realm Reborn, Bard didn't use their songs to go through phases. They had like a base gameplay, put up the dots, make sure you do filler, keep the dots up the whole time. But the big thing that you could do is you could play songs at the cost of reducing your damage in order to provide utility to the team. Mage's Ballad was the first one. You would refresh MP of all nearby party members as your own MP was gradually drained. If they moved out of range of you, they didn't get it anymore, and you could just cancel it whenever you used it. Army's Paeon was for TP, an old resource, used to be the physical version of MP essentially, and they got rid of it because it was way more of a pain than it was worth, especially as we got into Heavensward. The one song that didn't reduce your damage dealt was actually Foe's Requiem, or Foe Requiem as it's called here. That reduced all enemy elemental resistances by 10%. Fancy way of saying they took 10% more magic damage, but they did eventually rectify this and make it all damage in a later expansion. That I do remember off the top of my head. That was pretty much your I'm increasing the DPS of the team song, and you wanted to line that up with buffs. But back then, nobody really did buff alignment, so it was really just you played Foe's Requiem at the start, and you often ended up having to do Ballad or Paeon at some point throughout the fight otherwise. But yeah, Foe Requiem didn't reduce your damage dealt. Common thing that new players thought back then. They were like, oh, I don't want to sing Foes, it's going to reduce my damage done. Read the skill. Read it. But then they also had a couple of other skills. So I'm going to skip to Battle Voice. This would double the effect of any of those songs. So Foe Requiem, 20% enemy elemental resistance, even more MP or even more TP. Very common to use it with Foe Requiem, or to do a battle voiced Paeon or Ballad, depending on the fight. More often it was a battle voiced Ballad, but you really wanted to try to get it with Foe Requiem whenever you could. The big thing here is Reign of Death, which, nowadays is an OGCD shared with Bloodletter. Back then it was its own weapon skill, its own GCD, and was just an AoE. Like, that's all there was to it. At the very start of A Realm Reborn, it's not reflected here because this is actually from 2.5 Bard, not 2.0 Bard. But originally, Reign of Death used to also reduce the damage that all enemies hit by it would deal. So it was like, it was like a reprisal almost. And it was a very expensive skill TP-wise, but it was also very important to keep up during certain mechanics. So Bard's constantly having to play Payon just to even keep up with Reign of Death. You had to decide when to use it. That flexibility was pretty interesting back then, but it led to a lot of moments where you're just out of TP and just couldn't do anything. So I don't miss it, but it's funny thinking back on it. Then you have the actual class actions. This is actually not that different. There's a few things in here that are kind of wild to go back to, but let's start. Heavy shot, straight shot, those still in the game. Raging strikes, venomous bite, and then if we go down, there's also wind bite. The big thing with the dots, though, like the dots were relatively similar. I know it doesn't mention the dot effects here, but they had dot effects, trust me. It's just not pulling all the exact information. The dot only lasted 9 seconds at the early levels, and I think 18 at the later levels. So they eventually went up to 30, and now it's up to 45. So like they've gone way away from dot maintenance as the job's main thing. The first blast from the past here is Misery's End. Delivers an attack with a potency of 190 and can only be executed when the target's HP is below 20%. We used to have executes back then. Warrior has one as well, if memory serves, which we'll get to in another video. But yeah, that was something that we had to deal with. It was another OG CD that just made the end of the fight a little faster, I suppose. Oh, I can't remember. This one's Misery's End. That was Mercy Stroke. Mercy Stroke, I think, was the one for not even just Warrior. I think it was Marauders, so like some of the melees could take it as well. Yeah, that's a blast of the past. Shadowbind. So Shadowbind used to be a Bard exclusive skill. This one's not too surprising. Now we have the roll action that does the same thing. Is it Leg Raise? I can't remember what the roll action. I mean, I could just look. I have all the pages open, but yeah, I can't remember what the bind one is currently called, but that's there too. Bloodletter has pretty much, honestly, one of the skills that's changed the least over the years. Like now we have multiple stacks and the procs are only half of a Bloodletter proc, but the whole Bloodletter procking off of skills thing has always been an identity of Bard. It used to potentially proc off of dots all the way up until Endwalker, actually. And it used to be chaos because you'd get it. Sometimes you just get Bloodletter after Bloodletter after Bloodletter because it was always up. It didn't depend on Mage's Ballad like it does now. That was just something you were always maintaining. So much so that a lot of us Final Fantasy XI and WoW players, when we came over to A Realm Reborn, we actually made macros for Bloodletter, Misery's End, for off globals. Like it was a common thing that we tried. It took the people who were kind of more fresh-minded or willing to experiment or willing to just, confirm information to realize that the way macros work in this game, that's not very ideal. But it was, a practice I did. I told people about. A bunch of other people were also doing it on this job, on other jobs. But yeah, Bloodletter has always been a big thing for Bard, and it still is. It's part of Ballad, but whatever. Now, another big thing is Repelling Shot. So Repelling Shot and one of their other skills, which is somewhere scrolled down, I can't remember. I think it was called Blunt Arrow. This is the gap closer, same as it is now, or I'm sorry, the back step that we have now on Bard, but it had potency back then. So if you were really trying to min-max your DPS, you used Repelling Shot on cooldown. Like you had to be as wary as like a red mage doing their backflip would be. It got people killed. It got people killed a lot. But that's, 80 potency every however many seconds. I think it was like 45 seconds or something like that. And yeah, you had to keep up on that. Quick Knock, I think we still have that now. It's evolved, at the later levels. It's not Quick Knock anymore, but it just Conal AoE. Swift Song, that's Peloton now. Used to be a Bard exclusive action. Now it is now it's a roll action. So nothing really fancy to say about that. It works completely identically to how it did back then. Hawk's Eye, that used to be another. Dude, Bard had so many offensive buffs they had to do with like their cross-class actions and everything back then. Hawk's Eye, increase your dexterity, your main stat, by 15% and guaranteed that all attacks landed. Oh, yeah, we had accuracy back then. You had a chance you can miss if you didn't have a high enough accuracy. If you were raiding, you made sure you had a high enough accuracy, but there's always Hawk's Eye. There's always Hawk's Eye. Where, that little bonus effect. You would not rely on that, trust me. But, Dex plus 15% is a pretty significant buff. There's Wind Bite. Oh, we also had Enmity generation back then. So Enmity is a thing now, tank swaps, it's there. But back then, everyone kind of needed to chip in to Enmity. So Archer had Quelling Strikes. And if you were a job that could equip Quelling Strikes, you needed to get Quelling Strikes. It was not optional because not using it did very often mean that you were going to pull aggro from a tank. So that's a big one. Now Barrage, interesting. So Barrage used to make you hit 3 times per auto attack. Now that sounds kind of lame, but Barrage was actually a pretty major thing for bards. It was a major way to get DPS and a major way to lose DPS. Back then, auto attacks were not omnidirectional. So as a bard, if you weren't facing the opponent when you were doing your attacks at any point, you could lose auto attacks. And that was a big way a lot of inexperienced bards lost damage, like turning away during Barrage or not paying attention to the way their character is facing, especially people who used legacy movement back then. On top of that, different bard bows having different attack speeds could be min-maxed in Barrage. It was something that a lot of people didn't bother doing, and quite frankly, probably for the best. But these were things that had to be considered, and Barrage was an insanely powerful tool. Your auto attacks were a big part of your DPS on Bard back then. Blunt Arrow, a silence. It doesn't mention that here for some reason, but it was also a silence, now an interrupt. And same thing, if you weren't using it to actually silence something, you needed to use it on cooldown for damage. And what would happen is people would get used to using it on cooldown for damage. This happened with stuns too. And they would not have it for silences. It happened all the time. So that was a bit of a pain. One skill I really do miss is Flaming Arrow. This was just you put fire on the ground and it did damage over time, you know, like Assaulted Earth does now. We used to have a lot more skills like that, placed ground AoEs. What was funny, though, is when the game first came out, so many new players were told, hey, if you see fire, don't stand in it. You know how many tanks dragged enemies out of my Flaming Arrows as Bard, like, for the first couple of months of A Realm Reborn? Ugh. But it was a nice skill. Like, I imagine having that now for, like, the DSR, like the Dragon Phase, just putting it in between the two of them. You see Dark Knights do it with Salted Earth, but yeah, like I imagine still having that, and I wouldn't mind getting that back. I don't feel like that needed to go at any point. Wide Volley also didn't need to go. The superior AoE weapon skill for Bard, not this conal thing that we have now, not the Shadow Bite that you can get. No. Wide Volley, just AoE. And that was it. And it also gave you a chance to make Rain of Death cost no TP. You would never use it for that reason, but in dungeons, that was particularly useful. But yeah, Wide Volley was always the way to go. And keep in mind, Wide Volley and Quick Knock, I don't believe were combo actions. Quick Knock was more TP effective, and Wide Volley was more range effective, plus it had the proc. So if you could avoid using Wide Volley, you still tried to use Quick Knock, but Wide Volley, if it was just not possible for you to get in, it was just an AoE option back then. And the animation is so good. I miss that animation to this day. Then we get into cross-class actions. You have, I forgot about, I didn't really forget, but I didn't think I'd have to bring it up. The limit breaks, Pulse of Life. Bard had healer limit break back then. I have saved, honestly, I miss it to this day. I still think about all the times that both healers died to a mechanic, and I healer LB'd to save the team as a Bard. You know, it's moments, it's things like that that, you know, you don't really think about much anymore, but those are good times. Feint. This used to not be a defensive skill. This used to just be a cross-class skill. I think it's a Lancer skill. It doesn't, I think it inflicts a slow. I don't know why it doesn't mention that here. Something about the Wayback Machine just doesn't have all the information about all the skills. But the delivers an attack with a potency of 120. And I believe, yeah, it also slowed enemies. So it worked on like low-level enemies. That skill, not that used in A Realm Reborn, but on Bard, very much used in Heavensward. So that's one we'll probably have to revisit later. Featherfoot from Pugilisting. Keep in mind, for other than the limit breaks, for these other skills, you could only take 5. So as we go through, I guess I should say, most people didn't take Feint during A Realm Reborn. Featherfoot, if you were soloing maybe, but yeah, evasion by 15%. You couldn't rely on evasion, so it was just something maybe you did if you had a spare slot. Same with Keen Flurry, the parry rate. I knew a lot of people who took Keen Flurry for the occasional parry on physical AoEs. But it's still, the next bunch are really all the ones you took. Like those ones, it was like maybe, but the next ones other than Haymaker were all ones you definitely took. Second Wind used to be a cross-class action. You had to level Pugilist to 8 to then equip it to the other classes that could use it. And it was okay. I think it's more reliable now, but then Monk got Third Wind as like a trait, you know, and then so theirs was even stronger. Haymaker could only be used after evading an attack, so in raids you didn't really use this, unless a boss had like a guaranteed evade that you could trigger, because its potency is 170 on Bard, so if you do get an evade, I believe it's a decent bit better, if we can scroll back up, to like heavy shot. Yeah, heavy shot's 150, so it was okay if you could get the evade, but you had to know that a fight triggered an evade, or that there was a way you could get an evasion as a whole. Otherwise, you didn't take that. But internal release, invigorate, and blood for blood, you pretty much always took. Internal release, increasing crit rate from pugilist, had to have it. Invigorate, restoring TP, not optional. TP was already a strapped resource. If you didn't have this, you were actively griefing the people you were playing with. And blood for blood, you might be griefing by taking it, but people like damage. Increased damage dealt by 10% and increases damage suffered by 25%. You know how many people have died to room-wide AoEs from a poorly timed blood for blood, or not clicking it off, or just anything at all, just pressing it at a really bad time? Oh, yeah, that was a big one. But I mean, all of those offensive skills on top of Hawk's Eye, on top of Quelling Strikes, on top of Barrage, Bard just had a ton of buffs to manage when it came to endgame content. And then Mantra, it was only 5% for non-monks back then, but it's still 5% healing. You couldn't really plan around it, but it didn't hurt to have. So that was the last take. And then moving down to traits, our traits weren't too much different back then. Like, it was just, we had increased like base stat, base damage. Barrage, you know, auto attack strikes to 3. Before it said it increased it to 2. I thought it said increased by 2, but yeah, it increased to 3 here. And then River of Blood is the Bloodletter procs. Again, used to be off dots, 50% chance way back when, but now it's just every 3 seconds. We don't need to go over PvP stuff, I feel like that's a whole different video. Yeah, that's a Realm Reborn Bard. Pretty simple, was a very much played job. You know, it was the only ranged physical at the time. It was pretty much mandatory with Ballad, Paeon, Faux Requiem, like all the utility, especially really early on with Reign of Death. Their damage was not like, and right at a Realm Reborn launch, Bard was really high damage, and then it kind of, you know, leveled out as they started making job adjustments, but it was still popular and strong pretty much the whole way through. You never had a party without a Bard, and so. Times would, however, change drastically going into Heaven's Ward, where all of this stuff that seems kind of relatable to now, and, you know, you can see how the job began and how it still ended up to where it is today, but still kept a lot of its identity intact. We're going to take a break from that. We're going to talk about Heaven's Ward Bard. All right, now we pull it into Heaven's Ward, and this is where the ranged role just took a detour away from what we know it as now. During Heaven's Ward, we were introduced to Machinist, the second ranged physical job, and it came with a whole kit that was like very, very different than what we have now. But it also brought with it cast times. So you had casted skills on Machinist, and then your ammo would allow you to, you know, not have instant cast. That was fine, but for some reason they decided to also give Bard cast times with one of their new skills, Wanderer's Minuet. Works way differently now, but, you know, this is how it began. And as such, a lot of the job underwent significant change during Heaven's Ward. It was pretty divisive. I actually was okay with it. I didn't mind being a Bard turret, but all the people who really liked it in A Realm Reborn started to shy away. It was harder to play. It was far more nuanced, and it was also just not what they signed up for, you know, when they started playing the job. Summoners, you know what this is like. You start playing the job, you start kind of liking it, and then they change the whole thing, and you don't know if you like it anymore. It's the same thing, you know, that's when Bard dealt with it. A lot of this stuff isn't too different. The numbers are largely tweaked, but like Ballad still works the same. Faux Requiem still works the same. I don't know, Gamer Escape was formatted way differently back then for some reason. Paeon is still the same. Reign of Death. Oh, I forgot about this. So Reign of Death was now an OG CD, and it shares a recast with Bloodletter. So that's when this change was made. Interestingly enough, it still says weapon skill. I wonder if that's accurate, if it shares a recast with Bloodletter, because Bloodletter wasn't a weapon skill. It was an ability. So maybe it could just be that the weapon skill display is wrong. But I think that change was made here. Either way, I forgot that they changed it. The effect that it had before, where it lowered the damage they dealt, I forgot it was changed to lower their evasion. You once again never used it for that reason, but it's still funny. And then Battle Voice doubling the effectiveness. Minuet, that's the new song. Increased damage dealt by 30% while ceasing auto attacks and adding cast time to all Archer and Bard weapon skills. Yeah, so the big thing was, you turn that on when you could for sure stand still. Like, imagine if right now on Bard and Machinist, you didn't have necessarily, like, you didn't want to keep, like, main uptime on that. But imagine if you could enter into and out of a stance that increased your damage when you didn't need to be moving around. It kind of functioned like that, but the goal was to stay in minuet as much as possible, and thus it hard enforces the cast times. And then you have to know when it's okay to turn it off. How many GCDs of movement do you need to do? And that's when you would actually turn off Wanderer's Minuet and use Feint as a roll action, or as a cross-class action still. And that would, and that was how you kind of kept your damage going, but you could only do that for so many GCDs before it was a loss. So there was like a whole bunch of nuanced stuff from Minuet. A big reason why it didn't get kept. Imperial Arrow largely worked the same. It was actually a weapon skill back then. It wasn't an OGCD. I think it remained a weapon skill up until, I think, Shadowbringers is when it was made an ability instead of a weapon skill. I have to, we'll check, we'll see, but I think that's when. So it had the same kind of recast that it has now, but it was just had a different, you know, it was a weapon skill, just had a different recast from everything else. We have other skills that work like that. Gunbreakers are very familiar with that now. This is when Iron Jaws was introduced. Yeah, I didn't mention that. In A Realm Reborn, you had to manually redo both your dots every time they were going to wear off. So every like 4 or 5 GCDs, you would, you know, just roll your dots back over, roll your dots back over. Iron Jaws was a big game changer. Especially when it came to multi-target dotting. So that was a big get here. Wanderer's Pain, an ability that's still kind of weird to this day. It's one of those skills that like the job has, and you won't think about it most of the time, but that one time you can think about it, it's great. It's also really good in deep dungeons, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, that's just removes a single detrimental effect from party or pet. You can also, I don't remember if this was here back then, but you used to be able to, you still can put it up as a shield. And if you get a status effect, it'll immediately Asuna it. I don't remember if that was here and it's just missing from the description, or if that was added in Stormblood, but that's another thing. And then Sidewinder. So now Sidewinder is just an OGCD once every minute. It's kind of lame. Back then, it was more like Fester, that the version of Fester that Summoner had prior to this expansion, where it did more damage when you had your dots up. So if you had both dots up, it was 260 potency, up from a base of 100. So you never wanted to hit Sidewinder on something that didn't have both its dots. And so that was just there's just more dot synergy. It was just kind of a bigger identity for the job back then. Going into everything else, a lot of the stuff is the same. Misery's End, Shadowbind, Bloodletter, Repelling Shot, Quick Knock, Swift Song. All of this stuff is pretty much identical. Otherwise, they just added those cast times. And I think these largely stayed the same as well. Yeah, Blood for Blood, Mantra, Invigorate. Yeah, everything else is really the same here. We can see the traits real quick, so you can see what's different. Raging Strikes getting shortened down to 2 minutes once you hit level 28. Extends duration to 18 seconds. Yeah, all that stuff. Increased action damage. Other than that, yeah, it's still pretty much identical. We just got traits up to level 48. Traits weren't something because traits were like tied to the class and not the job. So it was weird. So like the traits never had anything to do with the job skills. Like they changed that eventually, but that was a really weird thing. But yeah, with Heavensward Bard, it was just a big time. Another thing is Heavensward is when every job got their own unique limit break. In A Realm Reborn, it was like you had the Monk limit break was for every melee. The Meteor was for Black Mage and Summoner. And then Bard had Pulse of Life, and then you had the healers who had Pulse of Life, and the tanks who had what was it, Mighty Guard or whatever it was. No, Mighty Guard was the lower level one. Whatever the Paladin Wall is, whatever the Paladin Wall is called. In Heavensward, every job got their own LB, but that also meant that Bard no longer had the healing LB. Not a fan. Not a fan. Should have kept it. Should have kept it, Square. We would have liked it. Yeah, and there's the slow I was mentioning from Fate. Yeah, it's mentioned here now, but it wasn't mentioned in the other one. What else was I talking about randomly that wasn't mentioned? Yeah, there's the silence effect. Yeah, I guess it's just Gamerscape didn't have the proper formatting, because a lot of this stuff is way better presented and formatted here in the Heavensward version. So, yeah, and Repelling Shot cannot be executed while bound, 10 Yawn Backstep, all that other stuff. The only thing that's still kind of weird is the weapon skill indication on Reign of Death. So that's about the only weird thing. But yeah, it's just those cast times. That was the big change. Toolbox, get out of here. I'm trying to do a video. And so yeah, with that, I think we can move on to Stormblood, where they turned it around again. All right, well, one big change with Stormblood right off the bat is we now had the official Final Fantasy XIV job guides. So now I can look at those instead of the Gamer Escape site. And again, I'm trying to find snapshots of these that are pretty close to the next expansion release, usually like 5 months out, 5-6 months out. So this one's actually from January 8th, 2019. And this, they got rid of the cast times going into Stormblood. They heard everyone say they didn't like it. The few people who did, they just ignored, and quite frankly, I can't blame them. And we went back to something that was more like the A Realm Reborn Bard, but still drastically different overall. We still had TP here. We still had things like Misery's End and Raging Strikes, but this is where you start to see the design of the classes really begin to change. And as we scroll down, that'll make more sense. All of this stuff, pretty normal. I think now dots were 18 seconds at base. I have to get to the traits to double check that, but I think they became 18 seconds at base. You know what? No, that might have been Shadowbringers. We'll see when we get to the bottom. Misery's End is still there. Bloodletter, Repelling Shot, Quick Knock, Windbite, Mage's Ballad. So here we go. This is the version of Bard that started using songs as phases in combat. So Ballad, Paean, Minuet like we have now. And that is an element that has been maintained up to this point. It's been pretty much the same for the last 3 expansions. You know, you got the recast time on Bloodletter, Reign of Death from Mage's Ballad. You got the haste stacks from Army's Paean, and you got the Pitch Perfect stacks from Minuet. So if you're familiar with the way it is now, then going back to Stormblood, this is where the familiarity is just gonna skyrocket. Foes was changed here to just be increasing the damage dealt, or the damage that any target in range took by 3%. I forgot to mention something about foes before. A big thing that would happen with Foe Requiem would be that a bard would go to put it up pre-pull before the boss was pulled, and then step in range of the boss and pull them. Oh, there's so much grief. Like, it doesn't sound like a bad idea until you think about how many bards were pre-pulling with Foe Requiem. It was rough, man. It was so rough. I have done it a few times. I'm not saying I was immune, but it was a thing. And sometimes really small arenas made it impossible to be out of range. So this is something I gotta mention. You know, we couldn't really do that nowadays, I don't think, but you know, we kind of do. You can with Dancer, kind of. Barrage still, so this is when Barrage was also changed to, instead of being auto attacks, it was now triples the number of strikes for a single target weapon skill. Very similar to what we use it for now. So this should be a much more familiar version, but also the 80-second Barrage. Yeah, everything had an 80-second cool look. Raging Strikes, 80 seconds. And you know what? With the 2-minute windows that we've had before, it's kind of nice to see something that doesn't say 60, 90, or 120, but 80 was weird, let me tell you. Paean 80 also, so when you're going through them, you know, 80 seconds was about the usual. I think they lasted 30 seconds each, so your song phases weren't on 2 minutes. They were like every 30 seconds you'd want to be changing into the next one. But what also happened, because they were 80 seconds on the recast, what ends up happening is that you actually have this 10-second leeway to make some adjustments at some point in the fight if you need to like delay one so that you can delay something else later. And that's the kind of flexibility we don't really have nowadays. And Bard had that in some way here in Stormblood, and then had it again in Shadowbringers with skill speed affecting these skills. Here there's spells, and I think that they changed to weapon skills and Shadowbringers, which then made skill speed affect them, which allowed you to be a little bit more flexible with them. Reign of Death is an off-global ability here. Battle Voice. Oh, this is where Battle Voice was changed to increase direct hit rate. That has stayed the same for the last 3 expansions. Then you have Minuet here. Also, I can't help but notice, it looks like all of the songs increased crit rate back then. Nowadays, the songs increase different things, like damage. I think it's Minuet is damage. I think Ballad is crit, and Paean is direct hit. I'll check, but I think that's what it is. But they were all crit back then, as you can see right here. So then Pitch Perfect, that works the same. Imperial Arrow, still a weapon skill, so you still had to use it, like, not as an OGCD. And it was actually the thing that you would barrage most frequently. I think it was that if barrage came... Oh, yeah, so this was a phase of Bard where your opener was a ton of RNG, and it could be the best opener ever or the worst opener ever. Ideally, you barrage a different skill, Refulgent Arrow. But if you didn't get a Refulgent Arrow during your opener, because it wasn't guaranteed back then, you had to then barrage an Imperial Arrow, which meant delaying barrage, which was a weird, it was a very frustrating time for Bard, specifically because of the RNG of the opener. I had forgotten all of this, and it's flooding back into me right now. Oh, Iron Jaws, Pain, Sidewinder, all still pretty much the same. Troubadour was way weirder back then. Nowadays, Troubadour just reduces damage taken. All the ranged fizz have something like it. Back then, Troubadour's effect was different depending on what song you were in. So if you needed it at a specific point in a fight and you needed a specific song effect, you needed to somehow guarantee you would be in that song during that time. And this also led to a ton of weird interactions with the ballad version. So Minuet reduced magic damage taken by 10%, or reduced magic vulnerability. Translates to roughly the same thing. I think it's different in the calculation, but still. Payon reduces physical vulnerability by 10%. And then Ballad increases max HP. Mind you, it increased the max, but it didn't heal you for that increase. For some reason, we had a bunch of max HP increases for a long period of time. But they didn't heal you. So you were just missing health and needed to heal yourself or be healed in some way. And so that was just what you had to, that was just what you had to do here. But what was funny is the max HP increasing has, and probably still does have an interaction with skills that require max health. If you have, oh man, how did it work? There was like a really weird thing where it's like if Troubadour fell off at the exact moment that like a max HP check was happening, then you could die instantly. It was something weird like that. Because I think it just meant for like a brief moment, like the value of your max HP and your current HP weren't the same. It was weird. You could also kill people by using it right before a max HP check because they wouldn't get the HP back. And there were a lot of max HP checks in Stormblood, especially in some of the tougher raids. So griefing. Here we go. Yes, Caustic and Stormbite. So this was the introduction of 30-second dots. It was just when you went for... So Venomous Bite and Wind Bite were 18 seconds at base now instead of 9. And Caustic Bite and Stormbite were 30 seconds at base. That's what it was. We also got Nature's Min. Still a very niche skill, the way you'll use it. You know, increasing shields or if somebody needs a lot of single target healing. But I mean, still, it's still something that you should be familiar with now. And then Refulgent Arrow. If you got a straighter shot proc and you got to use Refulgent Arrow, then you would use that on Barrage. If not, your opener was significantly like. Remember, this triples the weapon skill. So this is 230 on Imperial Arrow, and Refulgent is 300. So if you had to Barrage Imperial Arrow, it was 210 potency less. Anytime it happened during any buff window. Yeah, bards could get really frustrated at that real quick. This is also where we move from cross-class actions to role actions. So now things like Second Wind, Foot Graze, Leg Graze, those were all here. Peloton, but there were other things as well. We had Invigorate still. We still had TP. Peloton, which was Swift Song before. Tactician, which is now Machinist exclusive. But Tactician back then wasn't damage reduction. It was gradually restores own TP and TP of nearby party members while also cutting your enmity in half. Essentially, they made Tactician and Refresh here were their replacements for changing Ballad and Payon away from what they were. Machinist did have an equivalent to those, so because they both lost those support equivalents, they gave it back to them in the role actions. I've seen a lot of people wish we had Refresh still, and you know what? I can't blame them, because I really do wish I could help with the MP regeneration of a teammate once in a while. Head Graze was a silence, so Blunt Arrow was gone. Arm Graze is a stun. We don't have Arm Graze anymore, do we? I forgot about that. Yeah, we had Leg Graze for heavy, Foot Graze for bind, Shadow Bind was gone, Arm Graze for stun. This was melee range, so you had to get right up in melee range. And probably the skill I miss most, the role action I miss most for Bard, Palisade. This was literally, you put it on one person and they took 20% less damage for 10 seconds. It had a 2.5 minute cooldown. It was just a defensive cooldown to give to people, and I liked that. So I you know what, we could give it a Machinist. Give Machinist something like this, and you know, maybe we'll be a little more square. Okay, that's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. Then into traits, nothing too fancy here. It was enhanced Imperial Arrow, made it so that it guaranteed the trigger of the additional effects. So yeah, that effect of Imperial Arrow wasn't in Heaven's Ward, where it guaranteed that you got a proc, because we didn't have procs on songs back then. And it didn't guarantee like a Bloodletter or anything. So, or did it? I don't think it did. Let's go back. Did it? Did it do that? I don't think it did. Imperial Arrow. No. Can only be executed when under the effect of Minuet. That's all it was. It was just restricted to Minuet. Yeah, now because you have all the song gauges and everything, like you see here, now it has that, like, guaranteed effect. You can also see, like, the traits, the River of Blood trait, enhanced quick knock, raging strike, enhanced raging strikes, enhanced venomous bite. Yeah, they made all sorts of changes there. And then here you can see the other wide volley and flaming arrow gone. Blunt arrow, quelling strikes because of tactician and refresh. Hawk's Eye, Swift Song, Shadowbind. Yeah, all those deleted actions. This was the big time they started doing that. But yeah, this is a lot closer to what we have now, but there's a few things even here that aren't there anymore that I actually really liked on Bard. But Bard was also in kind of a weird place. It was doing okay at this point, but Bard and Machinist just kind of... Machinist especially, but we'll talk about that in another video. They just weren't appreciated a lot. There was a lot of questioning whether or not you wanted to bring Bard or Machinist, like almost more than there is even now for the party buff. But party buffs were even still different back then a little bit, but it's, again, a whole nother topic. But it was still a rough time. But this was for me a very positive direction for Bard. For me, it still is a positive direction. And now we get to just look one expansion ago and see how it even changed from Stormblood to Shadowbringers. And here we go. This is one expansion ago, so this really isn't that far away. If you followed any of my coverage on like the Endwalker Media Tour or anything, if you're newer to the game, this should be stuff you're kind of all familiar with if you're playing this job. But otherwise, you might still have a bit of curiosity here. So we have, again, all the usual stuff, Raging Strikes at this point. Most of the design is going to remain exactly the same. The only big difference here, first of all, Barrage guarantees Refulgent Arrow in this, guarantees that straighter shot ready proc. That was a big deal because up until that point, one of the biggest complaints was the RNG in the opener and reopener. Moving forward, critical hit rate, the battle voice got buffed a decent bit. I think this is also when, grants this, so that grants crit rate, that grants direct hit rate, and ballad increases damage. Okay, so I was wrong before. But yeah, so these all increase different stats now. I don't know why they decided to do that. Maybe because they determined that a permanent crit buff, even if it was only 2%, was just skewing way too hard, and that's why they put it specifically on Minuet, which is when buffs would have been. So that's probably the main reason. Then we have Imperial Arrow, now an ability, no longer a weapon skill. So that was a big change for Imperial Arrow. Iron Jaws, Sidewinder. Sidewinder still being affected by the dots, but way more now than it was before. Troubadour was fixed here. Reduced damage taken by self and nearby party members. I think this is when all the jobs were given that baseline AoE damage reduction. Troubadour being 62 is troll, because I think the other jobs, I think Dancer and Machinist at this point had that skill at a slightly lower level. We have the 30-second dots, of course, right here, and triggering straight shot ready on dot procs as well. Nature's Min. There's Refulgent Arrow, now 340 potency. Shadow Bite got added, which was basically AoE Sidewinder back then. Like, essentially, the target that you initially targeted it with, if it had dots and you used this AoE skill, then the AoE would be stronger. That confused a lot of people, but it doesn't work that way anymore. Now it's just that like proc off of your AoE. So yeah, I don't know if that's an improvement or not, but it's different at the very least. Apex was introduced here along with the soul gauge. Same deal. It works identically. There's just no second half. There's no blast arrow yet, but it was just, you got to max gauge and you used it. That was pretty much all that there was to it. And roll actions condensed a lot more. No more arm graze, leg graze, foot graze, head graze, second wind peloton, and arm's length. Up to this point, a lot of jobs didn't have knockback resist or built-in knockback resist. Now everyone had built-in knockback resist. This is also sure cast for casters, and arm's length was given all the melees and DPS and everything. And yeah, this is a very, very different time. Even just an expansion ago, just thinking back like 2 expansions ago versus 1 expansion ago, big changes. That's really it for skills. Then for traits, there's not really a whole lot here either. They just took away a lot of the garbage traits. Straight upgrade, straight shot to Refulgent Arrow, and still requires the proc. And then Quick Knock has a chance to reset the Bloodletter and Rain of Death cast time. Great, by the way, for dungeons. Really enjoy that. Bite Mastery 2, a burst shot for more, more damage filler. And this was also the introduction of enhanced Army's Payon. So in the previous one, Army's Payon had the haste, but you didn't get to keep the haste going into the next song. So you just, whatever, you had haste. That's all there was to it. While you were in Payon, you were faster. Then when Shadowbringers came around, they made it so that when Army's Payon ends, you get this effect for a short period of time. That would make it so that when you enter your next song, you would consume this Army's Ethos effect, and then you would keep some of that effect going into the start of your burst window. It was a pretty good change, but it did make the burst window a little stranger a little bit. It changed the pacing of it, because you now had that haste. So, while under the effect of Army's Ethos, singing Mage's Ballad or Minuet will grant Army's Muse. Both Army's Ethos and Army's Muse require stacks of repertoire, which will determine the potency of the latter. Yeah, and then those are the same potencies for the effect, the repertoire effect for Army's Payon. And then Soul Voice was just for the gauge. Anytime repertoire is gained at all, then that's when you were getting it. Then you can see the job gauges and the soul gauge and the simple mode. I think simple mode was added in Shadowbringers as well, if memory serves correctly. But yeah, and then that's our last step until we have Bard today. So, what a wild difference that we've had since then. Overall, it's crazy to see how much Bard has kind of gone through. It's gone through a lot, and it hasn't gone through a lot at the same time. When you look through the different skills that we've seen today, you see a lot of the same things just every time, but a few things moved or an effect change that really changes the way the job actually plays. I've gotten to the point where nowadays it's a little weird. They've moved away from a lot of the dot identity that was prevalent for so much of the job's life. And we don't really know what the future of that aspect of the job is, and it's in a confusing place, because it's gotten a lot of things that people praised it for, and it still has those things. But the way it's moved those things around means that amongst range, it's really a love it or hate it kind of thing. I actually like Bard now, but could it use just something fresh, something that gives it a good bit of feel back? Sure, and I think that's true of a lot of Endwalker jobs, but you can kind of see why us old heads kind of look back at some of these old skills and kind of wish we had them back. I said kind of like 6 times there. Who cares? We're leaving it in. But it is what it is. Bard retrospective look. Hopefully you enjoyed it. And we'll be doing a retrospective look at these skills for other jobs as well, assuming you guys enjoyed this one. So thank you for watching this video. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and stay tuned for more looks at the way jobs have evolved over the past however long. So appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, take care.